Okay, good morning and welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us again for part 2 of this session. My name is Nikelia Greg Wakarai and I am a tech with ICA, and today we are presenting to you this webinar under the CARICOM Agriculture Ag-Ready project in collaboration with the Caribbean Climate Responsive Agriculture Forum. And we have with us the project manager, with Shalini Marahaj, and we will have the presentation today by Ms. Joanne Stevens, and our support there, Ms. Shanna Prevo, and we also will have with us Mr. Dr. Chani and Martin. And so just to give a brief background to those of you who are new and not aware of what the forum is. So it is a knowledge to action framework, and so it's a regional platform. And if you may not have known, we would have with us today persons from Antigua, and probably as I'm calling out the name of your country, you could give a thumbs up. So normally we have the whole region together, listening and sharing some of the knowledge and their experiences through this forum. And so we have Antigua, Bahamas, the Barbados, Belize, Dominica, Grenada, Guyana. We also have Jamaica, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Lucia, good morning, St. Vincent, Suriname, and Trinidad and Tobago. And so we have the whole region with us here, lots of different experiences, lots of different accents, and it's always nice to, have that regional community, which is one of our objectives of the forum, is to build a community of interested and engaged persons across the region in the agriculture sector to help us, we know we have a lot of climatic issues to deal with, financial and the works. And so how can we use the forum to build that community? We also want to raise awareness and to share knowledge of, a lot of the climate smart agriculture policy and practices for the region. And, while we are similar, we do experience a lot of similar issues across the region. And so how can we raise that awareness and share the experiences on how each country have been coping and dealing with it? And beyond that, we want to promote coordination, have everybody at least on similar page, similar thought on some of the actions to address some of those climatic issues. And the key for us is not just sharing the knowledge, not just the talk, but how do we put that to action? How do we translate those technical knowledge, those discussions? How do we now implement that on the ground in our policies, on our farms, in our daily work? And so this is what the forum is about. And we are collaborating and sharing the experiences of this Ag-Ready project in the region. And now I'll pass on to Ms. Maharaj, who will give you a little background on what the project is about.
Thank you, Nikilia. Good morning, colleagues, and thank you for taking the time to join with us. If for some reason you cannot hear me, please let me know. I'll switch off my video so I have more effective bandwidth. So, as Nikilia said, the CCRAF Forum gracefully allowed us to feature our 4-part webinar series, and this is really towards the goal of strengthening the foundation for a climate responsive ag sector in the Caribbean. For those of you who weren't here last week, this project is is funded by the Green Climate Fund, with the Bahamas as the lead national designated authority. It is a readiness project, so whereas you may not necessarily have seen tangible assets on the ground, it is, as the name suggested, strengthening that baseline, that foundation for the region, to build a more climate responsive and resilient Caribbean sector. So today is our part 2 of the 4-part webinar series, and we have a representative from the GreenHouse Gas Management Institute, Dr. Joanne Stevens, and the GHGMI, together with the Caribbean MRV Hub, really did a significant amount of work in this project, both at a regional and national level. So in terms of capacity building, what Dr. Joanne Stevens here, together with the GHGMI and Caribbean MRV Hub, led several workshops, some of which is to help create or improve on each of the country's national action plans. And the countries that participated in this project and in this training would have been the Bahamas, Belize, Dominica, Haiti, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, St. Lucia, Suriname, and Trinidad and Tobago, as well as regional training on the GHG inventories, national training, more like a train the trainer, where Dr. Luan led training for farmer groups and extension agents. And then we had an on-the-ground farmer training in each of the countries in terms of inventory data collection. The GHGMI also provided us with a lot of work, and some of the deliverables that they finalized were national action plans for each of the countries, a regional analysis, as well as a national analysis on what's happening in the countries, and they proposed a regional data collection framework, which can then be used moving forward. So a lot of work was done in terms of capacity building, in terms of training, in terms of data analysis, not only at the national, but at the regional level. And again, these presentations were done from the policy level all the way to the farmer level. So a lot of work was done, and then that really gives me great pleasure to introduce our feature presenter, Dr. Joanne Stevens, fellow at the GreenHouse Gas Management Institute. So Joanne, you are up.
Great, thanks, Shalini. Maybe I'll just try and show my face. Morning, everybody. Hi, it's really great to be here, and thanks for the opportunity to speak to everybody a bit about some of the activities we had and outputs that we had on this Ag-Ready project. So let me start sharing my screen then, and I'll take you through some of the activities that we did and some of the results that came through from that. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes, thank you, Luan.
Oh, great. Okay, so as I mentioned, just let me see if I can move this bar. Yeah. All right, so my name is Joanne Stevens, and I'm working as a consultant for the GHGMI and working with the Caribbean MRV Hub on this Ag-Ready project. What we really were looking at was the agriculture greenhouse gas inventory and data collection processes in the Caribbean, and looking at the various mitigation and adaptation actions that have already been identified in the country's NDCs and inventories. Sorry. So I just want to talk a little bit about what information the greenhouse gas inventories provide us with and what's their importance, and then look at the importance of data in this process, have a little bit of information on the agriculture greenhouse gas emissions globally and in the region, and look at some data collection requirements and procedures and some of the outputs that came from and trainings that was done as part of the Ag-Ready project. And then we'll look at some key take-home messages. So really, I want to start with what is a greenhouse gas inventory and why is it important for us, for the countries. So all countries are required to report their greenhouse gas emissions to the UNFCCC, and this is done in reports. Usually these are done in the biannual update reports, which are submitted to the UNFCCC. The inventory reports can be submitted as a separate attachment to this or incorporated within these biannual update reports. And so all countries are required to start submitting these inventories, and as we move into the enhanced transparency framework, these inventories will be required to be submitted on a more frequent basis. So what is in the greenhouse gas inventory? So firstly, the greenhouse gas inventory shows the countries what their total greenhouse gas emissions are, what emissions they produce, or in some cases, some countries sequester, which means they don't actually emit any gases, but they actually take up some of the gases, the carbon gets stored, and so they are sequestering emissions. So they're not actually emitting. So the inventory tells us what the total amount is being produced in that country. Then also it tells us what the emissions are per sectors. In the inventory, there are 4 main sectors. This is the energy sector, then industrial processes and product use, and then we have the agriculture sector, which is linked with the forestry and other land use component. And then the 4th one is the waste. So the emissions per sector will tell you what contribution each of those sectors make to the total emissions in that country. And then also very importantly, the emissions, it also inventories report emissions over a time series. So it shows you the trends over time. Some countries report from 1990 up until currently, or more later, just depends on what data availability the countries have. So it also shows us a trend in those emissions for each of those sectors. So why is this important to us? So obviously the total is important so that we know what the country is producing. The sectoral emissions show us which are the dominant emitting sectors. So for example, in the global example in the previous slide, we saw that the energy sector was the dominant emitting sector. So if we're looking at this and we look at the sectoral emissions, we might suggest, or policymakers might indicate, that this is the dominant energy sector is the dominant producing sector, and so activities will be focused around reducing emissions in that major dominating sector, which is the energy sector in this case. However, we also need to consider the trends which are shown in the inventory as well. How do these emissions change over time? Okay, so, and then this may change where we focus our efforts in terms of mitigation. So for example, if your energy sector is the dominant one, but if you look at the change over time and you see that actually the emissions in the energy sector are not actually changing over time, but then you look at, say, another sector such as the agriculture sector, and you see that the emissions are maybe doubling every few years, you would know then that this is a concern. And so the country would need to start implementing actions in the agriculture sector to slow that increase in emissions in that trend. So if you don't have the trend, you might miss out on focusing activities within these increasing trends, because if there's an increase in a sector, then these sectors could become the more dominant emitting sectors in the future if actions are not taken. So all of these, this information in the inventories from the sectoral and the trends indicate where to focus resources to reduce the emissions in that country. And so developing a greenhouse gas inventory is an essential first step towards managing emissions. But what else can the inventory be used for? So as I mentioned, it's used for understanding the emissions and the trends in that country. But then what happens, because we have a trend, we can start to see from that trend how these emissions may be projected into the future. So if their trends are increasing, so we could expect that perhaps this would increase unless actions are taken. And so you can start to develop emission projections going forward into the future. So you could have a sense of what the country emissions may be like under different scenarios. And so you might think, if we implement these types actions A, B, and C, what might the emissions be in the future? And so you can start to develop projections from these inventory trends and set targets. And again, you can also then track the progress, because every few years you'll be developing the greenhouse gas inventory, and it will tell you what your current emissions are relative to what your targets are in the future. And so you can see, are you progressing towards those targets, or not. And so this is all information that can be developed once we have an inventory in hand. But what about data? Of course, data is critical. Without data, we cannot start even developing an inventory. And so we need to have some kind of data to develop that inventory. And so the data collection process is a critical step in the inventory compilation process. Okay, so when we talk about the inventory data collection for the inventory, because an inventory is a national, it looks at national emissions, often our data is at a national scale. So you would be looking at collecting national data sets such as livestock population or amount of fertilizer applied to soils at a national scale. Okay, and this information can then be used to develop your inventory. Okay, there may then also need to be other pieces of information that need to be gathered in order to assist making projections or mitigation targets. Because you would need to know, in these cases, you need to know how an action may impact those emissions. And this data may be collected at a smaller scale and a project level or a region level, farm level. And so you may also need to collect information at a smaller scale and incorporate these into the projections to make the projections realistic for your country based on information that has been collected on those activities. So there are different levels of data collection, but when we're talking about the inventory, we're talking about generally collecting national level data. So data is important because policymakers will use the inventories and the mitigation projections to focus mitigation and adaptation activities and to develop policies and strategies to reduce these emissions. Okay. Now, if you don't have data or it's too coarse, insufficient, or inaccurate, then inappropriate targets or policies could be put in place, and these could have negative consequences. So it's really important to have good data that is representative of your country, and using country-specific data is obviously the best approach. And if countries don't have data, it's often for a sector or an activity, then these activities are often not included in the inventory, as obviously countries would prefer not to make to put out inappropriate numbers or targets that are not achievable. So if there's a lack of data, usually these sectors or categories are left out of the inventory until data it becomes available. And so one of the things we see when we do, for example, during the Ag Ready project, we did an assessment of country nationally determined contributions and looked at the agriculture sector in terms of their mitigation contributions to the nationally determined contribution. And from the agriculture sector, the mitigation activities are really quite minimal. And one of the reasons for this, there are others, but one of the reasons is that there is a lack of data around the impacts. And so it's difficult for countries to have good data on what the current status is and what the impacts might be, and so to set realistic targets. And so it's very important. So it's very important so that we can collect data, so that we can enhance the contribution from the agriculture sector to the to NDCs in future. Okay, so what are the agriculture emissions and how important are they? So as I mentioned, in the inventory, from inventory point of view, agriculture is grouped with the agriculture, forestry, and other land use sector. So under the agriculture sector, there is most of the emissions are non-CO2 emissions. So these gases are your methane and your nitrous oxide. Okay, so they're non-CO2 gases. And so these are important because methane has a global warming potential about 23 to 25 times that of CO2. So even if your emissions are smaller than your CO2 emissions, the actual warming potential is greater. And so methane then becomes a more important contributor. The same with nitrous oxide, which has emissions around global warming potentials, which are around 300 times that of CO2. So even small emissions of N2O can lead to big overall global warming potentials. Okay, so they become very important, these non-CO2 gases. And so for the agriculture, we see a lot of these emissions from our livestock, mainly from enteric fermentation, or from the way that we manage the manure. This releases both methane and N2O. Then there's a lot of emissions from agricultural soils as we add nitrogen into the soils, okay, either through synthetic fertilizers, crop residues, urea application. Any application to the soils will lead to a subsequent emission of N2O. Okay, so that's all your nitrogen additions to your soils. And then also crop burning, if there's any crop burning, that leads to all kinds of emissions, both CH4, N2O, and CO2 emissions. And then rice cultivation, if your country cultivates rice, there will be methane produced from these flooded rice paddies. So that are the sorts of activities that lead to emissions under agriculture on your non-CO2 side. Under your forestry and other land use components, we also have CO2 emissions. There's a category for croplands, and this is where we incorporate our CO2 emissions, or sequestration, should we say. So this means that in this area, we look at carbon. So the carbon stored in the plants, so carbon in your biomass, in your tree trunks and your leaves and your biomass, also in your roots, and then also the carbon stored in soil. And there's a large component of carbon that is stored in soil. So these emissions and sequestration are accounted for here under the forestry and other land use. So you would have an emission of CO2 if, for example, you had some land degradation, or you chopped down, you had some agroforestry and you chopped down the trees, or you chopped down your crops, then this will lead to a release of CO2 because the carbon is stored in those in the biomass, and now you're removing it, and so this would lead to a release. Whereas if you have degraded land and you plant crops on those lands and start to grow plants or trees, then you start to sequester CO2 or take up carbon. And so this is removing it from the atmosphere. And so this would also be accounted for within the agriculture sector. So on a global level, the whole of the AFLU sector contributes around 18% to the total global emissions, with agriculture non-CO2 emission components contributing about 14% of this. And if we just look at the non-CO2 contributions of methane, that is methane and nitrous oxide under agriculture, from a global point, we see that enteric fermentation and livestock. So livestock really dominate these emissions. However, when we did an analysis of the ag-ready countries, there's just 9 of them across the Caribbean region, we get a different picture. And so this is why it's good to look closer into your region as to what's happening. So this is maybe not completely representative of the entire area, but across these 9 countries, it's found that actually the agriculture soils component contributes more than that from the livestock section. So your soils become quite important across the Caribbean region. Okay, this is not to say every country is different. This is just a regional perspective. But in some countries, for example, in Suriname, that have a lot of rice cultivation, then rice becomes the dominant one. But across the region, we're generally seeing that the agricultural soils are the greatest contributors. And approximately 9.5% of the emissions, of the total emissions from the region, are coming from the agriculture sector. This is slightly skewed in that this includes emissions from Trinidad and Tobago. Trinidad and Tobago is quite different from the other 8 countries in that their emissions are much higher, and also the agriculture sector has a much lower contribution. And so if we don't have Trinidad and Tobago in in that, then the contribution from agriculture could go up to about 28%. So there is potential in the region from the agriculture sector. So it would be quite interesting to do this and include all the regions across the Caribbean to see how this picture might change. But at the moment, we're seeing that agriculture soils are looking to be the main focus. The other interesting point, as I mentioned with soils, is that it has the capacity not only to have emissions, but to store carbon and to take some out of the atmosphere. So this is very useful and is often has a lot of carbon stored in the fields, and this is influenced by the different types of management activities that we practice in the croplands. Okay, so for example, if you have crop covers or no-tilling or agroforestry, and etc., these types of activities will enhance soil carbon and therefore create more of a sink rather than a source of emissions. Okay, the other thing with soil carbon and sequestration is that it has other co-benefits. And so with increasing soil carbon, you get to see improved soil health and fertility, improved food production and yield resilience. And all of these additional co-benefits prepares farms to better withstand the effects of climate change. Okay, so looking at benefits or implementing actions or activities that have co-benefits is also an important thing to consider. A lot of adaptation activities can have mitigation co-benefits as well. So we need to look at the big picture and try to focus on those that do have co-benefits, because then it's benefiting both adaptation and mitigation. Just a note that, when we're looking we need to look at the whole picture and all the activities occurring in that cropland area, because if you're just looking at soil carbon, you might think, yay, we're taking up soil carbon and this is good. However, if you are using a lot more fertilizer, then you're producing N2O, and so the balance of the uptake of CO2 and the emission of N2O may not be in a sequestration after all. So we need to have a balance between all the activities to ensure that there is actually an uptake of a removal or a reduction in emissions. So we just need to consider all the activities occurring in the agriculture sector. So what do we need to consider when we're collecting data? Since data is so very important for us to be able to assess where we are and where we are going, what do we need to know about data and data collection? Obviously, to understand what data we need to know how the emissions are calculated. Okay, and as I mentioned, with inventories, it also looks at trends and emissions over time. So we're also looking for data sets that are consistent and can be repeated over time or are sustainable over time. Because what we want to know from the inventory is that if there is a decline in our emissions from our inventory, we want to know that that decline is due to actions and activities that that we implemented in our country, and not because we had a change in data source or a change in methodology. So we also need to consider not only data in 1 year, but can we create can we repeat the data collection every year or every few years to incorporate the trends into the inventories. The methodology, again, needs to be standardized, so it's not due to changes in methodology. And so we follow the IPCC standard methodologies, and there are guidelines on all of these for each of the sectors. Basically, we need to have activity data and emission factor. Your activity data are things like your number of livestock, amount of fertilizer added, your management data, and your emission factors can either be taken as default emissions from the IPCC guidelines, or you can develop country-specific emission factors. Okay, so obviously the more country-specific information you incorporate in, the more realistic and your numbers are going to be for your country. So I think firstly, though, we need to look at improving the actual activity data. This is what drives the fluctuations over time. And then emission factors improvements in emission factors can follow. Emission factors are often more complex and more time consuming to develop and may need more resources. And so I think firstly, if countries can get improved activity data and then move to improving emission factors. And so to understand the requirements for the inventories, as part of the AgReady project, we provided a training course on agriculture inventory compilation, where this course was set out for inventory compilers and experts in the agriculture field. It was run as a virtual course over a 3-week period in which we actually had lessons, and then we gave exercises and homework for people and participants to practice with. And then we had open discussion sections where we could discuss the exercises and if there were any queries from the participants. So 26 participants were trained from the 9 countries, and they were not only trained on the compilation process, but also how to set up an inventory calculation file and how to use the templates and data collection templates. And this was all done through examples and exercises. And then participants were also provided with a certificate of attendance. So this really provided information on how the emissions are calculated and what data is required, because that's what we need to know. We need to know what data do we need to be collecting. And there was discussion on data collection in the region and also an assessment of the inventories in the 9 AgReady countries. And this assessment showed that still about half of the countries are relying on international data sources. And this is not necessarily a bad thing. It's good to at least have an international data source to start developing an industry to get a sense of where you are. But as you move forward and improve the data, it would be good to replace international data with local country-specific data, because these really show the actual trends and activities that are occurring in the country, because sometimes international data sources may not be collected every year, and so they apply gap filling techniques, and so you don't see all the specific variations seen within the country-specific data. So, but a lot of country-specific data is not collected just because there are many different types of data collection challenges across the region. And some of these are listed here. So, you know, the process of collecting data is informal or uncoordinated in that it's just requested as it's needed. There's no specific agreement to collect certain data sets. There's sporadic data, so it leads to inconsistencies in the time series of data, and then inconsistencies in the type of data that's collected. So maybe 1 year we're collecting for certain categories of livestock, for example. Maybe you're collecting for beef cattle and for dairy cattle, and then the following year it's only just for cattle. And so it becomes difficult to wade through all these inconsistencies. Sometimes it's just really a lack of knowledge of what data to collect, or data providers are not willing to provide data, and there's no real good data storage or archiving system. So there are many challenges. These are not necessarily only specific to the Caribbean. We often see these types of challenges in many of the developing countries across the globe. But we understand there are a lot of challenges. But what I need to point out is that it takes time to overcome these challenges. We don't need to change everything and improve all the data all in one go. Okay, it's a sort of iterative process. So you focus on what data you may need to improve first, what are the important ones, and focus on trying to improve that data collection process for that data set. And then as that comes right, then you bring on the next improvement. So it's not that we need to do this all at once. Some actions that could be considered as countries move forward in updating their inventories. First is to make use of existing data collection systems. I think that we always sometimes focusing on, we need new data collection systems, new templates, but this is not always the case. there are a lot of systems in place to collect data, maybe through extension officers or statistical officers. They already have ways of collecting data, and these systems are already set up, and they have processes. They may just not be collecting the type of data that you need. And so for this, you know, it would be good to work with these organizations to try to see how other important and relevant data could be incorporated into those existing data collection systems. Obviously, if there is data that's required that doesn't have an existing system, then new systems will need to be put in place. But, you know, try to make use of existing data systems already, because they're already working to collect other pieces of data. Another action may be to start implementing some of the best practices, which I'll talk about in a moment, and to raise awareness and build capacity around data requirements and data collection. So looking at some of the best practices, obviously, as I mentioned, the data collection process in many countries is not formalized. And so formalizing this process is an important step, particularly for collecting national data for inventory purposes. So this means setting up agreements between different organizations and the ministry that is developing the inventory. And so you set out agreements and agree on what type of data is required, how often the data will need to be submitted, what the format of that data would be. Then it's not necessarily such a cumbersome process for the compiler to always go out and collect data if there's a process of which the data is coming in to the ministry to compile the inventory. So to develop data collection strategies, to outline the process of who's responsible for what and where and when, and to define and collect the required data. And then the other step that is also quite important is to assess the quality and verify data where possible. So it's also not only just about gathering lots of data, but also we want quality data. We want to know that it's good quality data, where it's come from. And if it can be verified, if there's a second source that can verify the data, then this should be done to prove the quality of the overall inventories. Obviously, there may need to be some gap filling techniques used to fill gaps if data is not collected annually. Maybe it's collected every couple of years. And so there are guidelines on these kind of techniques that can be used to fill those data gaps. Because if you have country-specific data, and it is not every year, but it's every few years, it's still better to use that data than to use international data sources, and you can fill gaps with using the country-specific data. And then the last really point, which is really quite important, not only for inventory data, but for any types of data that gets collected, even if it's at a project level or a regional level, to document the data, associated information with that data. Where does the data come from? Did you make any assumptions? Did you have to manipulate the data in any way? Any of this information is extremely useful to document because it's useful for the inventory compiler to know how best to use that data and where it fits best into the inventory. So all this information provides a lot of background data, and it also provides transparency. And this is very important for the enhanced transparency framework and for inventories, that we're reporting information in a very transparent way. So that, and also it's important for countries to understand, so that if someone does the inventory this year, then it's transparent and clear. If then there's a new person the next time around to compile the inventory, they know exactly where everything came from and how it was used. So this is important just generally for data collection. So raising awareness around data requirements or data needs. So we often say in countries, oh, there's no data, but this is not always true. Sometimes there is a lot of data. It may just be difficult to find, or it might be in a slightly different format, but it could still be manipulated in a way that it can be used in the inventory. Okay, but data providers often don't know what the requirements are. And so it is good to talk to data providers, tell them the types of information that you need and what your requirements are, and then they can maybe have suggestions on what data they have available that could possibly be used. And so they could also maybe collect additional data if they can understand what the requirements are. It's also important to build relationships with data providers as opposed to just going to data providers and saying, we need data. You need to discuss with data providers and indicate to them how you will use the data and what the results, how the results will be used, how important the results are, what the outputs will be. So give them some information so they get a sense of what will be done and how the information will be used. And by building up these relationships, data providers may be more willing to share some of the information. And if there's any benefits to them providing data, then these should be highlighted as well. Again, so just to try to encourage data providers to provide information that may be required for the inventory. And also building capacity in terms of data collection, explaining good practices for data collection. And if you are not using existing data collection methods and have developed country customized data collection templates, it can have training on how to use the templates to ensure everyone is collecting the data correctly. And also, you'd be surprised, a lot of data providers are very interested in how the data is going to be used and how the emissions are calculated. It may be of interest to them or to their organization or to their farm to understand what their emissions are so that they can then work out themselves if they change their management practices on their farm or in the organization, what implications this may have for emissions. So just generally providing information and keeping people and data providers interested really helps the data process move along. So as part of the AgReady project, some products were produced to support data collection activities. And as Shalini mentioned, a regional data collection framework was produced. This is just a document that draws on information from the IPCC methodologies and just discusses a data collection process of how the steps step you through the data collection process. So it's a general data collection framework which can be used by any country, and even if you wanted to, you could adapt it more specifically for your country needs. But it's basically a stepwise process of the process for collecting data for greenhouse gas inventories. Also, a regional inventory improvement report was produced, and this just provides some information and tools, maybe on institutional arrangements, priority data sets to focus on. And this was developed by looking at information currently in the inventories across the region. Also provides some basic data collection templates that could be useful, information on those gap filling techniques that I mentioned, on how to smooth the data if you have very sporadic data, and this gives examples of how to do this, and also looks at things like QA/QC, what kind of quality checks can be undertaken, and reporting and archiving recommendations. So this is just a general document to highlight some of the information or tools or templates that might be useful to assist with data collection. And then lastly, as Shalini mentioned, capacity building was really our main focus. And so after the experts were trained, we also decided to move to a level of training the trainers. So this is looking at providing training for extension officers and farmer representatives. So we can't always sustain having consultants come in and provide training. So it's quite useful to train some people in the region that can then become trainers and train others in their country. So we are training the trainers, and then these trainers set up workshops with farmers and extension officers and provided further training at those workshops in their countries. So the train the trainer course was held over 3 days, and participants were extension officers and farmer representatives. And we looked at data collection procedures and requirements, also provided general background on what greenhouse gas inventories were, what climate change is, how farm management can impact those emissions. So altogether, we trained just over 60 participants, trainers in the region. And each of these trainers were provided with presentations and course material, notes, and some basic data collection templates, some one-page information pamphlets to hand out, all the sort of information that they would need to go out and then to train other extension officers and farmers in their country. So, as I say, once trainers were trained, then sessions were organized by the trainers and the national liaison consultants for the project to set up training sessions for farmers in the region. We did look back at feedback that was given during the trainers course on what the participants thought about the course that had been developed, and some simplifications were made because there was some discussion that we still needed to, it was still quite technical and we needed to simplify that more to get the message across to the farmers. So we worked with the trainers to do this, and we also assisted trainers and the liaison consultants to make country-specific adaptations to both their presentations and their data collection templates to make, so to ensure that presentations would meet the country needs. And so training sessions were held. There were 2 training sessions in each country, were aimed at around about 20-25 people in each training session. So it was around about 250 participants were trained using these train the trainer approach and all these materials that were developed. I think the lessons that we really learned from this process were that there was obviously an increased understanding of what climate change and greenhouse gas inventories were and what data collection was required. And what, interestingly enough, it was noted that farmers were more willing to share data after they had been through this training course. So this just shows that, you know, having an understanding of what's going to happen with the data, what it's showing, what it indicates, can encourage people to provide more data. I think that what interested me is that I was keen to see that, I was excited to see that enthusiasm from the farmers and extension officers. They were very keen and very involved in the processes and doing the exercises, and they were all keen to have more information. They wanted more information, or booklets or templates that they could take home to do record keeping on their farms or things like that. So there was a lot of enthusiasm and a call for more information. So this will be considered, can be something that can be considered in the next round of projects that will come up. Obviously there was a call for more training on how the calculations are done, what it means, just generally a lot of other subjects as well. There was a report compiled of the different suggestions that came out from these trainings. I think also what's not mentioned here is these trainings with the farmers and extension officers. I found this very interesting, and I learned a lot from this process, in that, you know, we always have the technical side, and then we have the people on the ground, and this process of trying to translate the technical information and translate it to farmers and extension officers who work on the ground in the field it's not an easy process, but it requires that everybody talks together and get together. And I think this was done partly through the discussions with the trainers and the national liaison consultants when we were developing the country-specific courses. And I think this is very useful, not only to get a course for the farmers, but to also for the technical people to learn more about what's happening on the ground, the difficulties on the ground, and what, how we can adapt the information and provide them with suitable and useful data collection templates or information that they can actually use. So you really get a transfer of information both from the technical and from in the field side. And so I think this sort of approach worked well, although we can probably do more of it in future projects. Consider this getting together to discuss best approaches for conveying the information and the relevant kind of templates to the people on the ground. So really, this really looks at all the sort of activities that were covered during the GHGMI part component of the AgReady project. And so what do we really want to take home from this is that data is critical. We need to have data to be able to understand where we are, what are our current emissions. So where are the countries at the moment in terms of their emissions? And then with this data, we can then look at estimating future emission reduction potential. So where would we be going? The future projections show us where we would be going in terms of emissions. And then importantly, it helps focus where the mitigation activity should be, in what sector and in what categories. And so appropriate policies can be put in place to manage these emissions. And so this will show us how we are going to get to those targets that the country is aiming at. And of course, best practices and capacity building and awareness are very important for improving data collection processes for inventories. And with improved data, this improved data will, through these updated inventories and projections, enable the agriculture sector to play a more prominent role in the climate change solutions, as we'll be able to say what emissions we have now and what we may be able to reduce in the future. And so incorporate these agriculture more into the NDCs in the future. So hopefully this information will be useful in assisting countries to get to that stage. I know there's still a lot of work, but hopefully during this project we've provided some background tools and methods that can be taken forward in the various countries. So yeah, thank you very much, and I hope that was useful, and happy to take any questions, or if anyone wants any more information on any of the outputs that I've discussed here, they are welcome to get in touch with me. So thanks.
Thanks very much, Luan, for this in-depth presentation. Easy to follow, easy to understand. For the participants, Luan would have gone into the whole GHG inventories, what that is, how the agriculture sector fits into that, and the contributions of the region as it relates to agriculture. We went again into what was done under the project, and go into the required training for that. We do have some questions in the chat already. Persons, please, if you have any questions, any comments, even had an experience with the whole GHG inventory, feel free to share those. You can type your question or comments in the chat. You could also use the raise your hand function, and once called upon, you could ask your question or give your comment. And so we will take the, yes, Kentisha, you can go ahead.
Good afternoon or good morning, depending on which country you're in. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much. Such a wonderful presentation. I do have a question based on possible maybe success stories, lessons learned, and case studies. Has there been any country or any organization that has been able to monitor this data by being able to require it at farmer registration? I know, so for example, in some countries, farmers have to register with a national database or with the government. If after training, if this was ever used throughout the government mechanisms or throughout these data collection mechanisms to be able to source data and be able to locate different areas of high carbon output.
Yeah, I think that we did discuss using farmer registrations. I think it was possibly in the Bahamas that we spoke about using farmer registrations. We didn't actually collect data from farmers from these registrations, but we did mention it as a possible data source. So any because it's something that is already done, and it's a mechanism by which data could be collected. So it's a really good point, and it is something I think that can be used, so that as farmers register, you could ask for small bits of information, or maybe already look at what information is being collected during those registration processes, and maybe even just add on 1 or 2 additional questions. Then a lot of information can be gathered through those processes. So that's sort of what I was talking about in terms of use existing systems. So if there's any system whereby farmers are registering for anything, maybe even for insurance or disaster, it could be one of those mechanisms by which through which data could be collected and used for the inventory as well. So yes, we did discuss those types of mechanisms that could be used going forward.
Thank you so much. Thank you so very much. I yield the mic.
Great. We'll take a question from the chat. So some 2 persons are asking, will the various trainings be repeated, or will there be an opportunity for the trainings again?
As under the Ag-Ready, yeah, sorry. The training they won't, there's no opportunity. The Ag-Ready project has been finished at this point, and so there won't be any more training under the Ag-Ready project, but there may be opportunities in the future to have additional.
Oh, Luan, your microphone is muted.
Oh, sorry. Here I am talking away. I was just saying that there won't be any more opportunity for the training courses. Won't be run again under the Ag-Ready project, as this has come to a close, but there may be opportunities in projects in the future to run more trainings, and also perhaps through the Caribbean MRV Hub, who does do some training through summer schools. So there may be opportunities in the future. I don't know, Shalini, maybe if you have anything to add to that.
Yes, thank you, Luan. So although the training and capacity building fell under the CARICOM Ag-Ready project, we did ensure that that capacity was built in within each country. So we do have representatives who were trained, and then they went on to train other persons. So it was a train-the-trainer type capacity building, where we do have persons in each of the countries who were trained, and then they have that capacity to move forward. So what we could probably do is we can maybe take a look at what resources there may be, even though the project is completed. I think there's an issue with Miss Adonis with that microphone. Right, so what we can do is we do have persons in there who have the capacity, so we can probably take a look at each of the officers in each of the countries, and then see what can be done in terms of resources, even though this project has been completed. The other thing is that under the project, we do have a knowledge management sort of platform or a portal where we will be sharing recordings, and we will be sharing all the reports, the analyses, etc. We have a lot of workshop reports, etc. So all of these will be available to you. So we do have options, even though the project has or is in the process of completion, we do have options where we can sustain and continue this capacity building. I hope that answers your question. Thanks, Luan.
Yeah, I think I saw a chat about just trying to find out who the representatives are in the various countries. So it might be useful to put together a list of the people that were trained in the different countries, so that everyone can connect with them.
Yeah, I think
but
that's
yes,
a great idea.
yeah.
And what we can do is we can upload it under the folder, and then we'll share it with all the participants. So that's part of the post workshop handouts as well. So
Yeah,
thanks,
yeah.
Joanne.
No, it's a pleasure. And you know, as I say, if you don't come right, you know, welcome to get in touch with me, and I'll put you in touch with the right people.
Thanks. The persons also can contact, for easier access, they can contact their local ICA offices for additional information there as it relates to that. We also have another question, Luan. What are some main steps to effectively collect data on a national level with regards to data storage archiving system?
Sorry, what was the first part of I heard about the national system? What did you say in the beginning? I didn't catch that.
What are some of the main steps to effectively
Okay.
collect data on a national level?
Yeah, so collecting data at a national level, there are, as I say, the steps are really, if you go through and formula, you need to understand what data is required first. Okay, so if we need national data on livestock data, for example, then you can contact various organizations that collect that livestock data and try to formalize the process and understand what data is required, and so that the information can flow from those organizations into the ministry that is developing their inventories. But I mean, and this applies to all the data sets. We need to firstly discover what information is out there and what can be coordinated, and then set up formal processes. It's there in terms of storing the data. A lot of, not a lot, countries are starting to develop sort of online data collection systems, where you can store all the information related to the inventories. And so if you have, you can keep track of information or formal data that comes into the system, can be documented and stored on these online systems. And there's only a few countries that have started to develop these MRV online systems, but I think that there are also a few that will be developed possibly through CBRT funding. And so I see that countries are starting to develop these archiving systems. And so I think really to identify who the main data source providers are in the country, and then to set up an arrangement with them to provide data into a central system, so that instead of having the compiler every year go out to one-on-one people and try and collect data, as this is quite time consuming.
So in the chat, we have a few persons, saying very great presentation. It was very informative and useful to them. Also, we have Eric, who is stating that great job on raising awareness on the importance of data collection and use cases of the data being collected, and how to extend the awareness and process to grow this idea of training to grow persons to conduct this. And they are very interested as an aspiring Bahamian farmer and agronomy students. We also have Ms. Green there. Perhaps such data could be collected as part of the national census, not with the census per se, but via the office set up to do so and the mechanisms. And she is also interested in, potential summer school training opportunities. Eric is asking, is it possible to connect with the people in Bahamas to learn from them? And so you could contact your ICA office in the Bahamas, and they could provide you with a bit more guidance on those, but I don't think Bahamas was part of this project. And so you could just contact ICA and we could guide you accordingly. Yes, Wilson, you go ahead.
Yes, how will the collection of the data and the implementation of the directives that data will give us impact the quality of life of Caribbean people?
Yes, that's
What's in
a
it for
very
me?
good question. What's in it for you? Yes, I think that often I realize that inventories and emissions is really way out there, and
I
so
think you're mute me. I can't hear you.
can every
Yeah, we can hear you.
We could hear her.
can you
Mr.
hear
Can you
us?
hear
Batiste?
me?
Yes, Luan, we can hear you. Mr. Batiste, can you hear this microphone?
Can you hear us? Mr. John Baptist, you could hear us?
Yes, I could hear you all
Okay.
now. Yes.
Okay,
In other
great.
words, the Caribbean man on the streets is saying, what does that have to do with me?
Yes. Okay, so yeah, it's a very good question. As I say, a lot of this discussion about inventories and emissions is quite foreign to the people on the ground, because it's really more about adaptation and resilience for the people on the ground. And so this is why I think that we need to link, and it's really quite important in the agriculture sector, is that a lot of the adaptation activities are linked and have co-benefits for mitigation. We are just not really putting those into the equations and looking for that in the inventory emissions. And so we're doing adaptation, but we're just not looking at the co-benefits. And so I think from an agriculture point of view, I know the emissions are difficult, but they are linked with the co-benefits of then producing, as I say, but at the same time as sequestering carbon, you're improving the soil fertility and then the productivity. And so these are all linked together. And so I think it's important when we speak to people on the ground to highlight those points, maybe not to focus as much on emissions, but to talk about it in terms of adaptation and resilience, because they are quite closely linked in the agriculture sector.
Yeah, Nikhil, probably I could come in here. Are you hearing me clearly?
Yes,
Yes.
we could hear you.
Yes, Wilson, a very good question. I just wanted to tell you, actually, that is the question that informed that project development, not the high level thing. It is really from that ground here, how we could actually do that. So it is very rooted in the ground coming up, first of all, not from the top down coming. I just wanted to clarify that for you. And one of the main things, I know we did not go into detail as to the project and how it was designed, but one of the main things is simply a question of, can we...
Somehow I'm not hearing you either.
Okay, is everybody else hearing me?
Yes.
Yes.
I'm not hearing you in the cage.
I think it's an issue on his end.
I'd love to hear Shanice and Mars, but I'm not hearing it.
All right. You could probably work on your end, Wilson, because I think everybody else is hearing me. And let me know if you hear me now.
Yeah, we can hear.
I'm hearing you now, yes.
Okay, great. So Wilson, I was basically saying that the exact question is the root of why we developed that project. It really started from the question of the farmers on the ground and how we could translate that need through the formal mechanisms that drive climate financing at a regional and international level. How do we tie that ground development into that? And the basic thing that we realized is that agriculture needs to develop sustainably. There are opportunities to do that. However, agriculture is not on the table or in the room where the major funds are, which is the climate funds, that they just simply are not there. And so therefore the question becomes, how does agriculture position itself as part of the climate solution so that these funds could translate or trickle to the farmers there? And it is simply one question because of how the global context works, because of these agreements. It largely tells you that you need to position that from an evidence-based point of view for the sector. And so therefore, to connect to these issues, whether mitigation or adaptation, that is where the project is coming from. We are simply saying that, yes, there's an evidence base from the farm up, going up, for agriculture to be part of the solution, and we want to be at the table because we need to bring that money, that these resources back to the ground from that point of view. So I'm very glad that you raised that question, but that is really what informed the development, not just the data collection for that sake, but how could we position agriculture at the table? So what is due in terms of the resources to develop for that livelihood, the daily thing, it comes into play. So I hope that that is very clear, that that is the message that we are doing. We are dealing with the man and the woman on the ground. Thanks.
Thanks for that addition there, Chani. Does anybody else have any questions or any comments that they would like to share? In the meantime, I would have posted a poll just to get some feedback from you on your screen. If you could take just a few seconds, a minute to answer them. Do we have any additional questions? If not, at the moment, Luan, if you just want to give, a little quick wrap up, and then we will close off officially.
Great. Yeah, no, thanks. Thanks to everybody for giving us this opportunity to speak. I really, I learned a lot actually from the process as well, and really talking to the people on the ground. I think that is really what struck me as being very important to ensure that everybody's on the same page from the ground up. And so we learned a lot from that. And hopefully we managed to translate some of this into the reports and the templates that we provided in the end. So we hope that the information and the training was useful, and we look forward to watching this space to see what comes out in the future, and how the agriculture in the Caribbean region can be represented. I look forward to that. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Luan, and thank you for your presentation today. I think persons did learn a lot on the GHG, even, what their role is and the importance of it. I will now give just a brief background on our next session. So we have another session next week, Thursday, same time at 10 p.m. I will send an email update on that. However, for persons who want to register, you should register via the link I have just sent in the chat. And I want to say a special thank you to everyone for joining us. And I do wish you a pleasant afternoon and balance of the week. Thank you, and hope to see all of you next week, Thursday.
All right, it was most definitely a pleasure meeting everybody. And I am very optimistic in seeing the strides that will be taken in the future. And I hope that we can partner together and come in unity and achieve a better goal, because collectively our output can be a lot better than what we can do singularly. So I'm pretty much excited about what the future can hold. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric.